Hi there, Avery.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Oh my God. Again, so what I was saying when no one could hear me because there was still not pushing out, I was having some technical difficulties with the layout. So apologies for that, but welcome to the March edition of Aventi Live. And that is one thing about live, you just kind of have to go with the flow when things happen. But joining me today are Michaela Gubbels and Jeff Thompson, two partners at Aventi Group. And today we're here to talk about virtual events. And throughout the live chat, we welcome your questions, so don't be bashful. And you simply type them into the comment area on Facebook. And throughout the live chat, we will take a moment to answer any questions that you have. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Michaela and Jeff.
All right. Thanks, Avery. And Michaela, thanks for joining today. This is the second of our Aventi live stream events. We're going to try and do a few more of these. Today, we're going to talk about virtual events, which is very timely, obviously, given our current scenario. I think it's a trend that has been happening anyway over the last several years. And our current challenges with the coronavirus are obviously forcing this to go faster in some places, but a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, I think, is relevant anyway. We just thought it would be good to share some of our learnings and experiences. We've had Aventi has probably worked with most of the larger tech companies in the area at one point or another in the last 10 years or so, and many of them are doing some really neat things with virtual events. So we asked a number of our staff to come back and share some of their experiences and their ideas and some best practices that they've seen. And we thought we'd go through those a little bit and just talk back and forth. Michaela especially has worked with a number of our clients over the years that have done some interesting things with virtual events. Brings a lot of direct experience. As I said, it's really a growing trend. In general, I think virtual events are proving themselves to be a powerful weapon in digital marketing, more so than I think anybody imagined. Multi-sponsor events have always been, predominantly something that people set up and go to physically, but a lot of the practices and behaviors and tactics that happen in the physical world are very translatable to the virtual world, especially with the advances in technology. We have a stat that someone shared with me, according to Market Research Media, the virtual event segment is expected to grow from already as big as 14 billion last year to about 18 billion over 5 years by 2023. So that's a pretty big business right there. That's a 5% annual growth. And beyond effective marketing, I think going virtual is an excellent way to further monetize an event and efficiently really reach a global audience. We'll talk about some of the impacts there. Add to that, the stuff we have going on right now. You're seeing great examples of virtual event techniques with small businesses, large businesses, industry groups, universities, high schools, and even local governments, and frankly, families in finding ways to communicate and talk on a regular basis. Michaela, why don't you start with some of the benefits of virtual events and some of the things that you've run across?
Yeah, I think you're right. This trend has been happening, and so we've been working with companies for years now that have started to transition to some virtual events. But it's important to talk about the why you would do that, right? So the benefits of live events are really enormous. They can be everything from the fact that you get dedicated attention, right? I mean, if any of us travels to go to a conference in Las Vegas or wherever, you get that person's dedicated attention, generally speaking. They're away from their office. They're actually more capture of an audience. So you get people in a centralized location. You get access to them and to all of their peers and the speakers. So there are huge benefits to that in live events. Add to that the ability to author new content or generate social engagement. What we've found is most of those benefits can also be achieved in a virtual event. And I think that's what we want to focus on today, is that you don't have to sacrifice a lot of those things when you move virtual. And again, as Jeff said, I mean, it couldn't be more timely with everyone actually having to shift to virtual, regardless of whether they want to or not right now. So that's the situation we find ourselves in.
But so travel is expensive, so virtual events have that advantage. But in the current situations, sometimes impossible. It's also a big commitment to attend an event. So I think physical events have been a good thing, but there's a lot of downsides to events.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think across the companies we work with, some of the downsides they've started to see, because I think attendance to some of the smaller live events has decreased, right? So the big ones continue to be massive shows, and that's great. But where you used to get that as a very important part of any marketing campaign, I think marketing organizations have seen attendance start to decline in live events. And I think it's because of the cost, right? For both the individual and the organization. So the individual who's traveling or attending, that organization has to sponsor their travel, they have to sponsor their T&E, they have to sponsor their out of the office, right? So it ends up being a fairly expensive proposition. Especially many of these conferences are charging multi-$1,000 tickets now, right? I looked at one last year that I was going to attend, and it was $2,500 for an individual, which is, prohibitory for a lot of organizations. So there's that, which is a cost for the individual, but then there's a cost for the organization. And if you're in marketing, you know this as well as anyone else. It's everything from the staffing, the organizing, the getting the booth space, then furnishing that booth space, getting the electrical, everything that goes into that cost. So it really can add up in terms of costs. And when you're looking at virtual events, you can have some significant cost advantage. You do have to pay for the technology, but there's some great technology out there that ranges from things that are 2D to 3D, and a variety of types of virtual technology that allows you to have very different kinds of events. And we'll talk about that a little later. One thing that's also interesting is we've really found that speakers will often speak for a fraction of the cost if they're doing it virtually, because it is not part of their entire, what'll we say, their existing menu of costs, right? So a lot of times you can get speakers to agree for a fraction of the cost if it was a live event.
No, I think those are all really good points. Just coming back to some of the other benefits or advantages that you start to see from looking into virtual events are how to attract or how to target and reach a much more widely distributed audience. Again, many of the companies that we work with are targeting customers all around the world. There's many different ways to do that. Events are tricky because live in-person events require attendees to actually commit. So on one hand, you get the focus and you get them, taking time off. On the other hand, that means probably, a large proportion of people can't do that. They can't take 3 days and just cut out what they're doing. Now, the workforce is located around the world. Many of our clients are virtually operating. Very senior people are working remotely. So this is much more common. Virtual events allow you, because of the opportunity to do things both live and on demand, you can deal with things like different time zones, different schedules and holidays. When you have to choose one date and one location, it really limits the amount of people that are able to attend. When you're a virtual event, a lot of that is you're able to deal with much more efficiently and give people other options. Another stat that we got is about more than 80% of marketers surveyed, this is by Virtual Edge Institute, have said that the key objective for why they're doing virtual events is to expand their organization's reach and audience. So this is well before any of the things that we're currently dealing with right now, is doing things virtually, just starting with something as simple as a webinar, sort of the original virtual event, allows you to have something live, but then have something that can be repeated and people can watch on their own. Events are a way to attract a younger audience who maybe we found in general is not that excited or interested in going to a physical event and walking around for 3 days. They're also cash conservative in a lot of ways. They don't want to spend the money on a ticket. very comfortable with digital technologies. So a virtual event is a perfect way for somebody who's trying to educate themselves, or for a younger entrepreneur or rising executive who's looking for ways to get access to information and talk to different companies and become more of an expert without having to fly around the world to different events. Finally, a third one is it allows you to target a lot more. So I've mentioned this in a couple different ways, but just in addition to spreading and reaching a wider audience, I think you can also focus your audience. Again, on a physical event, you can do some of the same targeting with your messaging, but the geographic limitations are significant. On a virtual event, you can find exactly your target audience. It doesn't matter where they are, and focus right in on them with messaging. And then finally, the fourth thing that I bring up would be just the ability to repurpose content. And that plays very well into virtual events, because it allows it to you to have the event content have a much longer life, longer tail. And so you can use things after and before the event in different ways to just spread out the experience and provide a lot more valuable benefits and results.
Yeah, I think that also really comes into the planning part, and we'll talk about that too. But I mean, knowing that you can get that amplification and reach these different audiences gives you some ways to actually use that content very differently, which can be very cool. One of the things that we also are seeing is that the data that you can get is very different. So in live events, we all are familiar with the badge scanners, and then for sessions you can do sign-ins. There's usually a lot of manual work involved, and it's not ideal data. I mean, you get their registration information from the conference organizer typically, and there's some good data there. But what we're finding with online and virtual events is that people are able to actually get just a much richer set of data. So that can be everything from what kind of content they're viewing. So if you have the kind of technology that allows you to have multiple kinds of content as well as calls to action for downloading things, you can really get a sense of what's the stuff that's attracting them, what are they engaged by. If you have engaging technologies, that's something you can really start to understand who's actually out there that really wants to engage with you and has questions about your product or service or whatever it is. And then, if they're interacting with each other, what resources that they actually take advantage of. Sometimes you have the ability to have sales reps involved in the conferences, and that's, again, something that you may or may not get at an actual event. So the data that you can get from the platforms tends to be richer, and it's something that can be easily shared if you have other vendors working with you or other sponsors, so that you can actually get everyone kind of a better quality of data to use for their nurture or whatever kind of campaign that they're running that the live event, the virtual event, is part of.
So before we hop into the next question, I want to address a conversation that's going on Facebook about getting into the live chat because people weren't being able to find it initially. So just for future reference, because we plan on having these all the time, when you're coming into a live chat, if you come into the page and we actually haven't gone live just yet, like we've told you it's going to be 9 a.m., but Avery's having technical difficulties, so we go live at 9:01, for example, you're not going to see it on the page right away. But if you refresh, it will appear at the top of the page as the first post, and then you can see it. It's a little easier to see it when you're on a phone, but I also have it open up on a second desktop, for example, and you just scroll down and you'll find it. So basically, you weren't having trouble getting to the broadcast. It just sometimes has a slight delay before it starts appearing on the page. But with that, and if that doesn't answer your questions, put more questions in Facebook comments, and I'll address them after the live chat, specifically on if you're having trouble getting to live chats, what can you do? But Jeff, one of the questions we often get is that the concerns that virtual events don't allow for networking or moving the sales cycle forward. Do you want to address that next?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great question. I think the jury's probably still out in terms of exact translation. Most salespeople that I've talked to would probably, I think 99% of the time, prefer a face-to-face meeting versus interacting with somebody on a chat or in a virtual event. But you can do chats, and there's a lot of really compelling technology, even things like video chats to do right there in the middle of an event. And I think as people get more comfortable with it, it becomes a much more viable way to talk to somebody. And again, the timing and the flexibility of how you're having that conversation is much broader than it is with more of a traditional, let's schedule a meeting and sit down and talk. So there are pros and cons. There's a lot, you can schedule something right from an interaction. Somebody can reach out and ask for either an immediate conversation or get something scheduled. There's also the opportunity for somebody to be doing their own research during the event, whatever that is, whether they're watching a session or a panel, and then do everything I guess the best way to say it would be to manage the procession of the sales cycle and when they want to talk and the vehicle they want to use. So I think there's a lot more of options. It's still developing, so probably not exactly as good or preferred to a face-to-face. But I think there's a lot of potential here.
We do have a question from Diana Klein. She wants to know what our view is on doing a virtual two-way event where it's a conversation versus a webinar or something that's more unilateral. Michaela, Jeff, do you both want to weigh in on your thoughts?
I took the last one, Michaela. Why don't you respond? I think you've done a
Yeah,
little bit.
we're going to address that in a couple of different ways. I mean, I think it really depends, which I just love answering questions that way. So it really depends on what your objective is, right? Webinars are fantastic, and one-way communication is fantastic for something that's a little bit more early funnel. Or if you've got a massive audience, right? So when you're talking about a keynote at a very large virtual event that you're trying to replicate, something like a Sapphire or a Adobe Summit, something like that makes sense to do as a webinar without interaction. However, interaction is really important, and that's where you get some of the great benefits of these platforms. So it really depends on your objective, where you are in the marketing funnel, and kind of how qualified your audience is and what you'd like them to leave with, right? So what would you like as that call to action from that actual event? I don't know, Jeff, if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that's true. Again, it's a lot about the technology and getting comfortable with it, but I think there's quite a number of ways that we're seeing a lot of creative ideas on how to make it more interactive.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about best practices. I mean, I think that what we're going to focus on is best practices for virtual events. And a rule of thumb is that most of the work that you would do for a live event is going to be the same work you'd do for a virtual event, right? So you need someone running the whole thing, right? Whether you call them a producer or event coordinator, having someone that actually manages that process, soup to nuts, for that visibility and kind of that cross-activity checking. There's so many dependencies typically between, whether they're speakers or scheduling or whatever. So having one person as kind of the ringleader is definitely important. Then it really comes down to getting the right partner. There are a huge amount of virtual technologies out there. And I think, with this shelter in place that a lot of us are under, I think Zoom has, really gotten some great attention as a great personal communication device. And I think that they are. I think they offer some very good things for companies as well. But there's a lot of other platforms to look at that have very different functionality in terms of their consoles. So what you can present and the kind of interactivity you can have. So getting the right partner is very key. And that takes not only looking at what your company may already be subscribing to, but again, what your objectives are, and then looking across those platforms for the kinds of interaction that they allow for, whether it's polling and surveys during the events. If they allow kind of multiple consoles or multiple windows within the console, that's a very effective way to have a very multimedia experience that's not just a talking head for 2 hours or something like that. So there's a mix of technology out there, and it can really benefit you to explore that before you get started. And then the next thing, which we talk about no matter what the event is, whether it's live or virtual, is just plan your story, right? What's the overarching theme and beginning, middle, and end that you're going to do for your event? So whether it's a webcast that's just a one-time thing, or whether you're trying to actually recreate a live event, you really need to have the overarching theme, and you need to think about what speakers can support that with what kind of content. But really planning that cohesive storyline is just key. And I think, whether you have a dedicated team, some companies have a team that's entirely dedicated to the storytelling that event will do, or you have a person, or you brainstorm that with 3 of you, right? It's really important just to get that down at the beginning and keep coming back to it, because it's so easy to get off track. And all of a sudden you're, adding people to your agenda that maybe don't have anything to do with the story that you wanted to tell.
No, that's great. We should come back to the earlier question about interaction. So part of this, so the story is very important, but at the same time, also thinking about the experience the user has, which is, or that the attendee has, which is a big part of that is the interaction piece. I was just thinking after the last question about some of the specific things that we've heard of companies doing or that we've helped them do. Interviewing an attendee right in the middle of the session is a way to sort of bring people involved. Online Q&A, some of that is more text-based, but it can also be live, more interactive with some of these new technologies. Quizzes are a way to get people involved. Features that different platforms offer to be able to try and bring the audience in more. Obviously, if it's just somebody speaking, that has a place. I don't want to suggest that you never have a one-to-many scenario. Just like in physical events, there are keynotes in virtual events, and there's an opportunity to really, which we'll talk about a little later, really make those a really enveloping experience. But at the same time, there are a tremendous number and growing number of ways to make it more interactive. A couple other things that to think about as your sort of best practices that we're seeing. The first one is just sponsors. Obviously, sponsors are a big part of physical events. They can be just as big in virtual events. And again, a lot of ways to really enhance what the sponsor is doing. It can be a sponsor that promotes some element of the technology that you're using for the event, or that highlights a solution or an element of the event sponsor's portfolio. So just a lot of the things that happen in the physical world can be translated pretty quickly or pretty easily to the virtual world. And then finally, another one is promote, promote, promote. So just as with any event, the advertising and all the traditional marketing tactics that are effective in telling people about your physical events, a lot of those translate very well to virtual events as well. And on top of that, there's the whole opportunity, just like you're doing with social media on physical events, to do more social media on virtual events to try and really bring people in and attract people. Avery is our resident social media expert and leads our social media practice at Aventi. So Avery, I don't know if you have any other comments on social media and how to use that with virtual events and maybe how that differs with physical events, but I think here would be a good time to have you talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, social media is key, whatever event you're doing in person or online. And I would say it plays an even more critical role online in some ways. And you want to have that conversation. You want to start promoting your event before it even starts happening, to get those butts in seats, because whether they're sitting at an in-person session or watching you on screen, it's still a button seat, and social media can help do that. And then it keeps the conversation going throughout the event itself. And then the beauty of social media is it just keeps that conversation going past the event. And that's actually critical, whatever kind of event you're doing. But the other couple of ways that social media can also help are in some of the areas we've touched on. So engagement, for example, one of the best things for creating engagement for a virtual event is to have a hashtag. And we actually just published a blog about that on Aventi's blog this week on event hashtags, best practices and such. And what that hashtag does is it gives us a way to have a centralized conversation about the event. And that doesn't matter if the event has multiple components. It could have some pre-recorded sessions. It could have a live stream keynote. It can have a webinar, a live webinar style interaction, right? During all of those, if you have an event hashtag and you invite conversation around that hashtag, that gives you one centralized place where you can see all the conversations that happened with your virtual event. It can also help with if you're doing a virtual event that has a lot of pre-recorded sessions, for example. You can interject some live Q&As via live stream, kind of like what we're doing now. And you could do customer interviews via live stream as a couple of examples. And you can also use social media to run contests to encourage participation in the conversation. So there's a lot of ways you can use social media to help increase the engagement around your event. And then when it comes to that whole networking and sales cycle area, it also helps in that aspect. If salespeople are doing the what I consider a social media best practice to help educate and inform, and they're on Twitter and LinkedIn, for example, and they're following that hashtag. Again, it all comes back to that hashtag. I'm big on them if you can't tell. If they're following that, they can join in that conversation with the customers and other visitors who are at your online event, and naturally answer questions and share information. So social media can help across all of those areas, actually.
Yeah, I think that contests are some of the great ways, because they get people coming back to that hashtag all the time. Man, there's some great things I've seen some companies do with actual competition and that kind of stuff at the event. So I want to talk a little bit about content, because obviously virtual events are awesome, but if you don't have content that's engaging, it doesn't really work all that great. So it starts with knowing your target audience. Who are you actually aiming to attract, whether they're prospects or customers or both, and understanding where typically they're going to be in the sales cycle, industries, and all that kind of thing. So just really making sure that you've defined who your target audience is and what your objective is for them. And then really looking at a range of formats. So we've talked about that a little bit today, but there really is everything from live to pre-recorded to broadcast video. The idea is if you plan ahead and think about what kind of content you're going to have and what kind of technology you'll use for that content. So let's say for the keynote, it's one thing. You're able to actually then polish your entire planning for that. So you'll have a very different studio need for something like that than something like what we're doing. In the live chat, it is much more informal, and that's a great thing for interaction, but it also then speaks to the requirements that you have for everyone's, camera and all that kind of thing. So really think about the kinds of formats that you want to use, depending on the kinds of content that you want to actually present. And when it actually gets to the content, I would say, generally throw out all the traditional presentation styles, right? I mean, it's great and PowerPoint's great. We all love it and live by it, but the reality is that it's not all that engaging. And if you put a single person up with a 20-slide deck, chances are you're going to lose your audience pretty quickly. So the idea is when you're talking interaction, build it in and use the kinds of content that you see in very engaging TED Talks where you've got a single graphic or a single word on a slide, but the kinds of things that hold attention, because attention spans are very short and decreasing every day, right? So how do we adapt our content for that? And that can start with everything like the title, right? Using titles, good best practices for blogs is a great way to start, like the 5 top things, the 5 best, the 10 best. People love numbers, they love lists, things that get people interested and hooked versus just kind of your typical, well, I'm going to talk about this product, so you name it the product and fundamentals or something like that. It's not all that engaging, right? So how do you speak to the pain that your audience may be having so that they actually get engaged from the title on? One of the things that we also have seen with all the different technologies that are available is the ability to brand the entire experience. So the different platforms will allow you to use different colors, different backgrounds, all sorts of images that helped your event have a seamless look and feel across the event.
That's great. Now, I think those are all really good recommendations. So I'm going to add to that by talking a little bit about presenters and their presentations. So just like in the physical world, there's a wide range of people that are effective and experienced at doing virtual presentations and virtual events, and those that don't have as much experience. And I'd say a lot of the traditional techniques and skills and training that you would go through for speaking in front of a live audience translate fairly similarly to a virtual event, to speaking in an environment like this. However, you don't have a live audience in front of you. So you're talking to this little white light. And the environment around you is also much more important. So a couple different things from a reactive standpoint, or as you're planning, talk to the people you're going to ask to speak about their experience speaking remotely. In a lot of cases, if they're good in front of a group, they'll be good virtually. There's just some maybe techniques and tips that can be shared. We're starting to actually, one of the things that we're seeing at Aventi is we're starting to get some requests for helping prepare people for virtual speaking or presenting at home, doing just live sessions like this. We have a fairly, or I shouldn't say fairly, we have a very good team of video folks that have been working on projects for us for a while. We're starting to package together programs that allow us to talk to an executive at one of our clients' locations, or just somebody who's going to be participating in an event, and help them prepare their physical environment at home, help them get the right equipment in place, set up the lighting, set up the sound, and then do a little bit of speaker training if they need it, just to help them understand some best practices and some tips to think about when they're going through. Some things that some of our team has shared back with me. It's okay to make it fun, but try and also make it authentic and human. Try and present the concept that you're having a conversation with people, even though you're not looking at them, as much as possible. As Michaela talked about, mix up presentation content and multimedia, different types of slides and graphics, photos with traditional diagrams, even bullet charts at times. All that still has a place, but there's much more of a need to try and mix it up and be a little bit more creative. Interactivity we've talked about a lot, so I had that jotted down here, but I'm not going to go through that again. But again, that all I'll say is that as the person who asked the question earlier said, that's critical. So just finding out and thinking about how to keep the audience that you're talking to engaged and participating, so that they don't have a tendency to rush through the presentation or pause it and watch it at a later time. Give them a reason to stick around, make it fun and make it interactive.
Yeah, and one way, Jeff, that we've seen to do that is actually chunk your content, right? So like a 5 or 10 minute section of content with a poll at the end that could even then determine the next content you present, right? So an ability to get feedback at the end of a small section keeps people a little bit more engaged, and you can use it as a dynamic way to actually ensure that you're tuning that content for your audience. So there's a creative ways to kind of also chunk your content down using interactivity.
I agree, and there's so many people working on this that the creative ideas are sort of coming day to day. All you need to do is do a little Google search. There's a lot of articles on virtual events and a lot of examples of some really, really fun things people are going to do. So the last thing I bring up just on presenters and presentations is the planning and the preparation that you can do, which is somewhat more expansive than what you can do in a physical event. In a lot of the events that we are participating in with our clients, there's an opportunity for, in some cases, to prepare the environment, do a lot of testing, make sure that you're ready to go. But in a lot of cases, there's not. You're dealing with busy speakers who sort of have to show up an hour before the presentation, make sure they understand what to do, get up on the podium, give their presentation, and leave. And so there's a lot more of leaving things to chance. You really don't have to do that with a virtual event. There's so many ways where if you're willing to put in the time and the preparation, you can do dry runs. You can do rehearsals, you can test the lighting, test the sound, test everything, so that you feel a lot more confident going into it. Obviously, as you saw with today, you still are going to run into technical difficulties. So those don't go away, but you can have a lot more confidence that you've at least thought about all the different scenarios and you've left as little to chance as possible. And you also have things you can do when things like that come up, to get through them more quickly, so that you can do a lot more planning. I think that's helpful. It allows you to curate the event a lot more than sometimes you can do in a physical one, where you don't have when you don't have the speaker and the participants audience or availability as much as you do with virtual events.
I agree, Jeff. Sorry, I was going to say I agree, and I wanted to do two things. Just let people know that we're sharing in comments different resources throughout the chat, and two of them are blog posts on the Aventi site about how to set up and what kind of equipment you need and execution recommendations, including speaker prep, so you can find some additional resources. But I also wanted to take this moment to interject because we have a few questions from our audience. So
speaking of interaction,
I don't want to save them all to the end. So one is from Suzanne Tolhurst. She wants to know, how do we decide which app to utilize for an event? And she's picking some social media. She lists Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, etc. But I think we can expand that question because it's not just social media. There's other platforms when it comes to virtual events. So Michaela, do you want to kick that off? I have my ideas on social media, but in general, how do you go about picking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. There's no easy answer, right? I mean, I think that they all have some significant advantages. And it depends too. If you're part of a large company, they typically will have the platforms they've already licensed that you'll obviously want to start with. And it depends the kind of target audience that you want to attract, right? So there's very big differences between people who go to the different social media. And I'm sure, Avery, you're going to talk about this, but like, you get very different audiences and very different comfort levels and very different amounts of interest in whether you're doing a Facebook Live event or you're doing a invite only broadcast, right? So it really comes back to that beginning thing, which is who are you aiming at and what is it you want them to do?
Exactly. And that same thing applies for social media. When it comes to picking a platform to do there, part of it is, what do you have access to? For example, LinkedIn live streams, you have to get permission from LinkedIn to be able to do that. And your page needs to be a certain size. So you're blocked out of that, even if that is your best platform to live stream to. And then, so it's, what do you have access to? What do you feel comfortable to? Where are you at? But most importantly, it's, where's your audience? Where do they want to meet you? And that's how you choose a social media platform. We have a couple of other questions and comments, so I'm going to interject a few of them here, and then we can continue on and save some for the end.
Hang on, just one other comment.
Oh, sorry, Jeff.
And I think this is something that you have sort of taught me over the years, but I've had some similar questions from people about virtual events. Well, why would you pick Facebook or why would you pick LinkedIn? And my answer, and I think you'd agree with this, is it doesn't necessarily really matter where you start. And that's sort of a neat thing about a virtual event like this or similar ones. It doesn't matter where you start, because you'll see with this event and what we're doing at Aventi and what a lot of our clients are doing is, even though we're doing this on Facebook, you're going to see the content from this shared on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Twitter. So that's sort of one of the neat things about social media as it's existed for a while, and even more so today, is that everything becomes integrated. So everything is sort of contributing to an overall story and an overall message. And as Avery said, you pick the platform that makes the most sense at the time, but that doesn't lock you out from reaching your audiences on other platforms.
Really good point, Jeff. Really
no,
good.
Not at all. That's an excellent point. Thanks for throwing my words back at me.
Sorry for
No, that was perfect. That's what a live chat's about, right? You know, it's conversation versus just a scripted presentation. So we have Diana has another comment, and it's presented as a comment, but I think it makes a great talking point. She says, as marketers, I think packaging a virtual series to enable ongoing communication and drive engagement for clients might be a great way to build trust. Do you two want to weigh in on that?
Well, I just talked, Michaela, so it's your turn.
I'm trying to like parse the entire thing. So by having a series, you're building trust because you're able to essentially nurture with it. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I would say, you know, if you have an ongoing, not unlike what we're doing here with Aventi Live, right? If you package a virtual series, so it's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think you can do that in a number of ways, especially, I mean, depending on, you know, what it is you are marketing, right? There's a lot of ways to evolve that conversation and actually to sort of combine the idea of a nurture and build that trust along the way. So absolutely, it's a really great point, and something to take into consideration in the planning, like how do you want the story to evolve over time, and making sure you address the kinds of typical questions that people are going to have and objections, right? I mean, that is something that happens in any sales cycle, and events can be used very effectively to do that. Even something as silly as having open office hours can be part of that nurture, right? So that in evaluation phases, people can dial in and ask questions that are much more technical in nature that you wouldn't even think is part of a virtual event, but it really is part of that nurture series.
You know, you made me think of a couple of things while you were talking about it. I think, there's a reason why video in general has been getting more and more popular over the last, let's say, 5 years or more. And I think part of that is because it is personal, and there probably is a trust element to that. I know that there are times when if I'm considering a purchase or looking for information, I just want written material or some graphics. There's another time, depending on the nature of the purchase, whether it's personal or business, where you do want a little more of physical, not physical, but visual interaction with the person you're buying from. And it allows you to have a lot more of an emotional element to it. And I think trust is probably a good word. I really hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
But I think if you think about a sales cycle, something that's complex, especially if you're selling a product that has a lot of elements, the ability to see somebody that you're planning to buy from in person and live and ask them questions is very, very powerful, and probably more available in a virtual event environment where you can have a quick one-on-one than a physical event where you have to line up behind 10 other people to ask your question, or scheduling some sort of follow-on meeting. So I think there is a lot of value there. It's a great question.
Yeah.
And then we have Andrew Lockhart brought up an interesting point. It was back on the topic of promoting events. And he says he likes to use partners who already have an audience. In his space, which is InfoSec, he works often with the SANS Institute. He goes, it leads to excellent registration and attendance rates because they promote the event too. He goes, it costs more, but the results are usually worth it, in his opinion, depending obviously on the partner. So do you guys want to jump in a little bit on bringing in partners for live events or virtual events?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say I 100% agree, and I think that's where we talked about sponsors earlier. Like, it's a broad category, right? It's someone, whether they're co-presenting with you or they're a related agency that you can use as a partner for the event. I think it goes to really thinking through all the kinds of reach that they can amplify for you, as well as then what credibility they offer to your content, right? Because it can be both. It can be both ways, which is really great.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think it's another great point. One thing about marketing in general is copying and using other people's stuff is a big part of what all of us do. And I think even copying your competitors' ideas is that competitors often flattered. I think that you're doing that. It shows their value. So with a partner, I think another thing to think about is if you're a group within a large enterprise or a company that maybe hasn't done a lot of virtual events or is new to webinars, then finding a partner that seems to be good at it or is doing some things you really like to see or you think are really effective, partnering with them and engaging with them allows you to sort of learn some of their best practices much more easily, while also giving them some value because they get to participate too. So it's a great way to build your own skills and experience without having to start from a blank piece of paper.
Great. I'm gonna move us along because I feel like we might have stretched this out a little too long. But speaking of engaging our audiences, however, I think one of the most important things that Jeff just hit on is really archiving and repurposing your content. Right. It is an amazing technique that you can do. You can divide up your content into smaller chunks. And again, if you do that, if you plan that in right from the beginning, you actually can get really digestible, smaller videos that you can use on different channels. And there's some really great things to do. So important to archive as quickly as possible and get that content available to people in a variety of channels, as well as to the people that attended or maybe signed up and didn't attend. But that recency is super important, and no one tends to really follow up if you wait 2 weeks to follow up with the content, right? So the timeliness of it is very important. We recommend 24 to 48 hours for getting that content back out there to the audience that attended, as well as other folks. Then there's a longer term content strategy that we talked about. If you have it in your planning to really then start to reuse that. If you had speakers, get the permission up front to use the quotes from what they're talking about, right? That can be another way to repurpose what they've talked about in other assets, which is a great thing. And then we're going to move to leads, right? So all of this was done for a purpose. So what do you do with those leads? And one of the things that should happen is you engage, you capture this behavioral data we talked about, and then you score the leads appropriately and route them where they need to go. So that can be as formal as a CRM system. It can be as informal as, here's a list of the email addresses and names of the people that we're asking questions, right? And we've done, even at large corporations, very informal things that inform the sales reps to say, these are the people that attended our education broadcast and actually ask questions, right? And for a sales rep, that's valuable data, because they may have 40 to 50 accounts. And if they know the 5 or 10 people who are really actively asking questions, they can act on that immediately. So there's a variety of ways to do it. It doesn't have to be completely sophisticated. Awesome if it is, and if you have the attention of your ops team to really help, that's fantastic. But be sure that you can use that behavioral data to somehow qualify those leads and then get them into the right hands of your team to follow up.
Great.
Jeff, I want you to wrap up.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm just going to sort of close this out with some final thoughts just on what you do after the event. I think virtual events are an excellent opportunity for organizational learning. We're all learning how to do this. There are, as we've said, companies that are better at it, individuals that have a lot of experience about it. But the first thing to do is get out there and do some of these and do some postmortems, for lack of a better term, at the end. Try and figure out what went well, what didn't went well, what you can change. Maybe if there was multiple different elements of an event, which groups or which individuals really seem to have it down, and to have some tactics or techniques that you could use elsewhere. I've seen with some of our physical event clients that we've helped, some of them, a couple of companies in particular, have done an excellent job over the last few years of trying to not centralize everything, but learn from all the events they're doing around the world, especially large enterprises, and try and have a centralized place where everything is captured so that you can find out what's going well, i.e. best practices, and start replicating those. Same thing can be done with virtual events. There's a lot of experts out there and a lot of them are talking right now about what their experiences are. So there's a lot to learn. I think the biggest thing is we mentioned this earlier, is to not be afraid to get out there and try. One of the last points I'd make is that there's a lot more leniency for people attending events, because they're not giving that when they're virtual, because they're not giving up that much. They're giving you an hour, but they haven't paid $1,000 to get there and spend the night. So if you do an event, doesn't go that well, you have another chance, and there's sort of not a lot lost. So there's not a lot of downside to getting out there and doing it. You might realize you have a real powerful capability that you haven't been using. So I think that's any other comments, Avery, to wrap us up?
No, just say, when it comes to virtual events for analytics and doing a postmortem to understand what's going on, a really good tool I found, if you're using an event hashtag, is hash tracking. Not only do they give you all the analytics and best tweets and what have you, best Instagram post around an event, around in a hashtag, you can also get an entire transcript. So it allows you to dig in and see what kind of comments were really resonating across the audience, what kind of questions they have. So the postmortem is a great idea, and definitely the analytics is always a good idea. So any final thoughts before we close out? Okay,
no,
so
I will add. I mean,
okay,
I think Jeff's point, like, just the best part is just trying something, right? And have a plan, and then let's see what results are, and then adjust from there, because they're a lot less investment to do. And we're just seeing some very, very cool stuff come out of them. So I would definitely encourage you to give it a shot.
And I would encourage the live part too, because it's scary, and obviously things can go wrong, and it's live. So you kind of have to go with the flow. So it's kind of circling back to the start of this one, and that's okay, because the audiences really are pretty forgiving. I've never had anyone say anything because we had some technical difficulty at some point during a live stream. So with that, I want to thank Michaela and Jeff for joining us on this chat. And I definitely want to thank everyone who joined us in the audience, and especially for all your questions. I love when we get questions. And make sure to tune in next month in April. We'll start promoting that in the not too distant future for our next Aventi Live. Thanks. And have a great day.